Tony Hawk will go down in history as one of the most famous skateboarders to ever live. For the better part of 3 decades, he's been the face of skateboarding in mainstream media. He invented many of the tricks skateboarders still do today, and his video game series completely changed the trajectory of skateboarding culture. While many people know Tony Hawk for his success, few people know what it took to get there. Tony has gone from just another figure in an obscure subculture to revolutionizing skateboarding and somehow becoming a household name in the process. Today, we're going to take a look into the life and career of Tony Hawk. Tony Hawk's parents were already in their early 40s when he was born in 1968. He had several older brothers and sisters, but because of his age, most of them were out of the house by the time he was a kid, effectively making him an only child. However, just before the last of his siblings would move out, his older brother would introduce him to a new trend called skateboarding.
My older brother was a surfer, and he got me into skating. And then he would drive me to the skate park once a week, like come home from college and take me to the park. And then I just got hooked. Like that was my home away from home from that point on.
Luckily for him, growing up in San Diego in the 70s, he was basically in the epicenter of skating. Almost from the start, Tony was determined, spending as much time skating as possible. He had incredibly high standards and was extremely hard on himself. His borderline unhealthy obsession didn't make sense to anyone around him, but it's precisely what allowed him to progress the way he did. As a scrawny little kid, Tony didn't do well in normal sports. With skateboarding, he didn't let his size stop him, and would even use it to his advantage. He'd have to get creative in order to do certain tricks, which led to a lot of the innovation that he's now known for. Since he was spending all of his free time skating, it didn't take long for him to get good. He started entering contests when he was only 11. By the time he was 12, Tony Hawk was already a pro. Mind you, turning pro was a little different back then, but nonetheless, he was competing at the highest level possible.
I turned pro when I was 14. Yeah. But when I literally went pro, I was filling out an entry form to a competition, and I had already reached the top of the amateur ranks, and there was a little box that said pro and a little box that said am. So I checked the pro box. That was it.
After picking up a few sponsors, Tony eventually landed a spot on the now iconic Bones Brigade. This was a brand new team filled with all of the best skaters at the time. Rodney Mullen, Steve Caballero, Mike McGill, Lance Mountain. The skaters on the Bones Brigade team are largely considered to be the godfathers of skateboarding. A majority of skateboarding tricks that are still done today were invented by the members of the Bones Brigade. Not only that, but they released some of the first ever skate videos. Now, these days, you might not think putting out a skate video is that monumental. And honestly, people back then didn't think it was either. Even the skaters on the team saw it as some annoying project that they just had to do. However, these cheesy little videos would completely shift the landscape of skate culture. They were only expected to sell a few hundred copies, but ended up selling tens of thousands. As one of the leading members of the team, this shot Tony into the spotlight even further. Meanwhile, he was also entering every contest possible, and for the most part, was doing well. This was a period when new tricks were being invented left and right, and Tony was a major contributor. Between the contest and the videos, he was in a great position. It was a bit of a right place, right time scenario because skateboarding was undergoing a renaissance, and Tony was at the forefront. On top of winning tons of contests, he was landing roles in some of the first ever skateboarding movies, which only helped him get even larger royalties from his skate sponsors. Skateboarding was a massive trend that was perfect for the late 80s, and since Tony was one of the best skaters around, he was directly benefiting from it. By the time he was a senior in high school, he was already making around $160,000 a year, which adjusted for inflation is closer to $500,000. Now, what did he do with all this money? Well, he did what any high schooler would do. He spent all of it. When you're young and earning a lot of money, it's easy to think that it's going to last forever. This is a trap that Tony fell right into. He began wasting money on tons of useless things, just like you would probably expect. This includes parties, vacations, and even a tanning bed for his sister, which is extra wasteful when you consider the fact that they lived in Southern California. Out of everything he purchased, one of the only valuable things he owned was a house that his dad convinced him to buy when he was still in high school. Since Tony was so young, spending money didn't seem like a big deal. But as he would soon learn, the good times would only stick around for so long. See, the thing about trends is they grow exponentially before eventually dying out. As one of the biggest trends of the 80s, skateboarding wasn't immune to this. Although the skate industry today is well established, back then it was still in its infancy. Just as skate parks and skate companies were starting to develop, the entire industry crashed. Skateboarding was viewed as nothing more than a fad. It was some fun toy that was popular for a while that had eventually run its course. Sadly, just as Tony rode the wave of skateboarding on the way up, he also rode it on the way down. Most skateboarders don't have backup plans. Honestly, many of them don't even have a high school degree. Skateboarding is a young person's game, so if you want to be one of the best, you have to dedicate yourself to it at a young age. But what happens if skateboarding doesn't work out? How do you make a living when all you know is skateboarding? These were pressing issues that many pros at the time found themselves dealing with, including Tony Hawk. After the meteoric rise of skateboarding in the mid to late 80s, it had a very steep decline in the early 90s. Not only was the skate industry shrinking, but street skating was starting to take over vert skating, which was pretty much the only kind of skating that Tony did. Skateboarding as a whole was dying out, and Tony's discipline within skating was dying out even faster. Month after month, Tony's royalty checks were getting cut in half, and there was nothing he could do about it. Tony dedicated the majority of his youth to skateboarding, and when it started falling off so rapidly, he didn't have anything else to turn to. The thing is, he also didn't want anything else to turn to. All he knew and all he cared about was skateboarding. It didn't matter how he had to do it, he was determined to find a way to skate by any means necessary.
I'd say 92 to 96 were the most struggle in terms of trying to make it as a skater, trying to support a family.
As the money began to dry up, Tony was left with very few options. He was in his mid-20s, he had just had his first kid, and he couldn't afford to pay his bills. This is when he made a risky decision that very few people would make. Remember that house his dad made him buy when he was in high school? Well, by this point, he actually owned 2 houses. With his income drying up, he realized that he wouldn't be able to pay for both, so he ended up making an incredibly bold choice. He sold his newer house, moved his family into his old house, and used the extra money left over to start Birdhouse Skateboards. By starting his own board company, he could still make money skating and be involved in skating, even if the industry wasn't as big and no one wanted to see his style of skating specifically. It wasn't a terrible idea, but at the time, it was incredibly risky. Mind you, this was a period when the skateboard market was shrinking year over year. Skate companies all over were shutting down, and here Tony was making the decision to start a new one, all while the industry was in a state of decline. As you might have guessed, things started out pretty rough. The company could barely pay for their salaries, and their salaries could barely pay their bills. Tony would even have to resort to doing skate demos in parking lots and editing other companies' skate videos for money. The worst part is, this rough patch wasn't a short-term thing either. Birdhouse was founded in 1992, and for years, it struggled just to stay open. By 95 and 96, there were serious talks about shutting the company down forever. Fortunately, there was a light at the end of the tunnel, and after going through a few dark years, skateboarding, along with Tony's career, was about to make it out on the other side.
And there is your champion at the Extreme Games, and your champion for all time in skateboarding, Tony Hawk.
Certain trends just make sense for certain time periods. In the case of skateboarding, it first got popular in the late 60s because it fit that time period. Then, it got popular again in the late 80s because it fit that time period. Well, by the late 90s, the public was ready for skateboarding again. In 1995, ESPN launched the inaugural Summer Extreme Games. It featured tons of weird extreme sports that most people had never even heard of. Barefoot water ski jumping, sky surfing, bungee jumping, and a bunch of other miscellaneous sports were all broadcast in mainstream competition for the first time ever. Among all of these random extreme sports that were featured was skateboarding. Since skateboarding was something the public was already familiar with in the past, it ended up being one of the most popular events. Over the next few years, the Extreme Games would eventually become the X Games, and they would refine the entire competition. They dropped a lot of the weird sports that no one had heard of, and instead chose to focus on the things that got the best reception. Fortunately for Tony, this not only included skateboarding, but vert skateboarding as well. The mainstream exposure of the X Games helped push skateboarding back into the spotlight. Birdhouse skateboards finally started to grow, and Tony's personal skate career also started to do well again. Then, in 1998, the course of Tony Hawk's career and the course of skateboarding as a whole would change forever. During the Best Trick event at the 5th Summer X Games, Tony Hawk became the first person to ever land a 900, which has since become one of the most famous moments in skateboarding history. This was a trick that he had been trying for over 10 years, and by landing it for the first time on TV, the significance of the trick and the energy of the crowd made its way into the mainstream. Coincidentally, at the time, he had also been working on a little video game called Tony Hawk's Pro Skater, which was set to come out just 2 months later. It ended up being an absolute perfect storm because skateboarding was rapidly growing, and Tony had a lot of buzz around his name. As many of you might know, the game ended up selling millions of copies and spawning dozens of sequels. The Tony Hawk's Pro Skater franchise would be the catalyst that exploded skateboarding's popularity in the early 2000s, and also helped define the music taste of an entire generation. To this day, the Tony Hawk Pro Skater games are known for having some of the best sales and best soundtracks in video game history. With the popularity of the games, Tony Hawk became a household name. He began getting tons of endorsements and sponsorships from every type of company you can imagine. Tony would go from barely paying his bills in the mid-90s to making millions of dollars in the mid-2000s.
He handed me a check for $4 million.
Oh,
That happened.
wow.
The best part is, he didn't just keep it all for himself. In 2002, Tony Hawk founded the Skate Park Project, which helps get skate parks built in underserved communities. Since its founding, the Skate Park Project has helped fund over 900 skate parks and has given away close to $10 million. Tony eventually started scaling back his competitive career, but continued to take on a lot of cool side projects. He's done multiple skateboarding events with a loop, he's made the world's first ever sideways loop, and he's also put out several video parts. At the age of 48, he was still able to do a 900 on a vert ramp, and at the age of 50, he put out a video doing 50 different tricks. These days, he still skates multiple times a week, and is still finding new ways to innovate. Despite the problems and backlash he's faced along the way, Tony has managed to spread skateboarding in ways that very few people have. Regardless of money, fame, or accolades, Tony Hawk has stayed true to skateboarding because that's what he loves to do, and skateboarding wouldn't be where it is today without him.
Obviously, I'm hugely thankful to still be able to do this for a living. Like this is what I love doing more than anything, and I would do it for free. Like any day of the week, you know, at any given time, I'd happily just go skate. It just happens to be the thing that I'm successful at. So I get to do what I love for a living, and that's living the dream. I mean, living the dream, I'm not talking about financial success. I'm talking about loving what you do. You know, if you love art and you do art and maybe you get a little bit of success at it, you're living the dream. I know there are so many kids out there that feel the way that I did when I was a kid, just awkward and not excelling at one thing in particular and not cool. And skateboarding was my way out of that.